Ellison, just wanted to go through some of the data that you might have been receiving from Zwift if you undertook the baseline ride that we did as a group on Monday, and you may have well done it on your own at some other points over the last few days. We obviously talked a little bit about this on Discord at the time, and we introduced the idea that the main reason for doing this was to raise some awareness of the different energy systems and how we're all slightly different as athletes, and how this does lead into the fact that we try to train everybody slightly differently when we coach them. Now, the results that you've received from Zwift in an email will include something that looks like the screenshot on the right hand side of the slide here. Now, we were talking about the fact that it would likely give you the results from the 3 segment efforts that we did, and how Zwift would then describe your phenotype as a rider. So it's likely to put you in the bracket of a sprinter if you were better at the short effort. It will put you in the bracket of a pursuiter if you were good at the medium length effort, and it would class you as a time trialist if you were relatively better at the longer effort. Now, as you know, we did 3 efforts, slightly out of order actually, considering the way they've presented the results here on this slide. So the first effort was the medium one, which was around about 2 minutes of effort, which is a very anaerobic effort. We then did a short sprint of 20 to 30 seconds, which is mainly from the creatine phosphate system, which is the short-term energy system, and some of the anaerobic system as well. And then finally, we did a long segment, which was around about 10 minutes in length, and that is very much aerobic in nature at that point. It was all crammed into one ride, so it's not necessarily the most scientific way of doing this, but within 50 to 55 minutes, most of us gained greater knowledge of our physiology and how we produce energy as a rider or as a triathlete. Now, we talked about this, and it can be quite easily sort of to be misled when you're diagnosed here as a sprinter. And I don't want you to see this as black and white, like sprinter bad and time trialist good. It's not a case of that. It's just about understanding your tendencies and your strengths and weaknesses. That's all. Now, if we look at the breakdown here for this rider on the right hand side of the screen for this baseline ride, you see that they managed to push 8.3 watts per kilogram for the shortest effort. They then managed 4.6 watts a kilogram for the medium effort, and they managed 3.4 watts per kilogram for the longer effort. Now, what's more important here, to put it into some context, is to look at the percentile range. So as far as I can tell from a little bit of research, this is separated by gender. So men should be compared only to the men riding on Zwift, and women to the women riding on Zwift. And here we can see this athlete was scoring in the 73rd percentile for sprint ability, the 63rd percentile for anaerobic ability, and the 64th percentile for the long segment, the aerobic ability. So you can see the anaerobic and aerobic are very similar, around about 63rd, 64th percentile of all Zwifters, and they were better relatively at the shortest effort, the sprint, because they were actually up at the 73rd percentile, so near the top quarter of all the racers on Zwift for sprint ability. So this does not make that athlete a sprinter. You know, with a sprint capacity of 8.3 watts per kilogram, that is unlikely to put you anywhere near the league of Cavendish, etc. And certainly the track sprinters would be astronomical numbers compared to that. So it is not saying that you are a good sprinter, or it is not saying that you are weak at the other two. What it is saying is that you have performed better against a cohort of similar people in the sprint compared to the other two. So that's the first thing to take away from this, is that it's not black and white. We're not looking at just simply classifying somebody as one thing rather than something else. And if you do come out as a sprinter, it does not necessarily mean that that is in itself a bad thing. Now, we know that triathlon, even down to a sprint triathlon, is very aerobic in nature. So we certainly want that to be the bedrock of our training. But there are cases where we want to improve somebody's anaerobic ability, which is beyond the scope of this little presentation now, but certainly something that we need to consider on a case-by-case scenario. So I'll just present a few more of these facts and figures that athletes have been sending to me, particularly those who have been labelled as sprinters or pursuiters. And it was perhaps our fault for leading people to believe that we wanted everybody to present to us looking like time trialists. So here's a little bit of the background to how to look at that and interpret your own data as well. Now, firstly, remember that this is one moment in time. It's one test on one evening, and it doesn't sort of categorize you in your entirety. You may perform slightly different on a different evening. And if your results are all very similar, as we're going to see here, Zwift has to categorize you. They've said that's what they're going to do. They're not saying you are a slight sprinter or you are slightly pursuit based. They are going to just classify you as that, even if your results are very, very even across the board. So the results on the left-hand side are the ones that I've just shown on the first page. If we look top centre, we can see somebody who's cycling at a very, very high ability, likely an A category cyclist. You can see their sprint ability is just about 12 watts per kilogram, and that puts them in the top few percent of everybody on Zwift. The medium anaerobic ability is in the 95th percentile, so a little lower, but still very good. And you can see as the segment distance or duration increases, their ability relative to their peers just drops a little bit. So still a very good result at 4.5 watts per kilo for what would have been about 8 minutes probably of effort. But that is now dropping them down to about 92nd percentile. So relatively weaker, not weak, but relatively weaker. So you can see there they would have been classified as a sprinter, but they are really quite even across the board. But perhaps improvements in their cycling ability will come through, addressing the aerobic system. So still working hard in sessions perhaps, but working controlled hard and maybe just below threshold, etc. But again, I won't go into the training aspects of this. If we look bottom centre, again, we've got 9.9 for the short, 6.9 for the medium, and 5.1. So we can see here a relatively weaker sprinter, but quite even across the other two. Now, because the long segment is slightly better, again, this athlete would be classified as a time trialist, but they've got quite an even split between the anaerobic and the aerobic ability. They're very similar in nature, and that one's mine actually. So there's a little a little clue into my first test that I did. Top right, again here we can see somebody at 5.6. That puts them in the 66th percentile, and then 4 watts a kilo in the 70th, and 3.3 for the 75th. So again, this athlete gets better relative to other people the longer the duration. And that's an interesting fact. Again, that's something for middle and long distance athletes. Maybe that's something that we'd like to see, but it's difficult to say for sure. And then finally on the bottom one, this just highlights where there's perhaps been an issue. You can look at the sprint segment at 4.4. It's almost the same as the longest segment. So we can expect here that something went wrong on that test. Either they missed the start and finish points, maybe they had a gearing problem or slipped the chain, maybe there wasn't enough resistance, but something you can see here, we just need to bear that in mind, that just that sprint ability just looks wrong. It doesn't seem to fit the trend. Whereas the other two are quite evenly balanced around about the 80th percentile at 5.2 and 4 watts per kilo. Okay, so again, if there's errors like that, we just need to be mindful of that. So those are, some of the test results that we've had. The main, again, just going back to the main reason for doing this, is to raise your awareness and open a discussion and make you start to think about this. And that's all we want then, to have discussions between us or with your coach. And hopefully then we can tinker with your training programs to get further improvements when you might think that you're halting or you're stalling or you've reached a plateau of some sort. Now, as you may know, I did the test originally a couple of weeks ago, and then as we were coaching it online on Monday, I repeated it. Now, the initial results are the ones I'd just shown you, which are on the left-hand side. And then in the 2 weeks since I've finished my season pretty much and just started to ride the bike a bit harder, do some threshold efforts and above threshold efforts and not train as many hours per week, I wanted to see what the difference might be. And I wasn't expecting much within a couple of weeks, but again, repeated maybe 4 or 6 weeks down the line to see what was happening. Now, again, what's happened here could be small differences just based on the day and nothing too significant. But we can see on the sprint, which was obviously the second effort that we did on the day, my ability dropped a little bit. But I think the reason that it dropped was I managed to scrape out quite a bit more power on the very first effort that we did. So the effort up the first hill, I managed 0.7 watts per kilo extra, which I think is probably indicative of that change in training, move away from sort of long sessions, allow more recovery, and then hit 3 bike sessions a week really quite hard. And that's shown this boost in anaerobic ability. Now, I'm not saying that is what we want necessarily in all the athletes, but I do think that's quite good that it's showing that this Swift test that we've done has shown how the training has influenced my physiology in a short period of time. And I think that's quite accurate. That reflects the training that I know I've done. So that's quite interesting. And then at the bottom, my the time up the volcano climb was only 1 second slower on the second one. But the power, again, they've rounded up and rounded down. So there was less than 1.1 watt per kilo difference. So that's largely stayed the same. Now, what's interesting is, obviously, the first time I did it, I was classified as a time trialist. And now that anaerobic ability over 90 seconds has improved quite a bit, that's edged just above the long effort, perhaps because there was some fatigue there or whatever. And now it's classified me as a pursuiter on the second effort. So again, I have not changed massively within 2 weeks, but so we're not saying that we should hold to these classifications wholly, but they are an interesting way to look at things and help us, perhaps judge how our training is affecting us. What I also think is quite useful is to look at what you prefer as a rider and how you tend to ride, and it's likely that you will be able to pick up which of these you are even without doing the tests. Also looking at your background, whether you're from team sports background, whether you've done cycle racing, you were good at sportive rides, or whether you were better at crit type racing. Again, it gives an idea even without doing the testing here. So just some interesting points, I think. Now, finally, all I'd like you to take away from this is become aware of what we're talking about. If this is interesting, go and learn a little bit more about it. Perhaps do a little bit of reading on this. It's very similar to the critical power model, as we mentioned online on Monday night. So if you want to look into critical power in a bit more detail, you can do. And again, your coach may be able to direct you a little bit more as far as that's concerned. If this is just the start point where we can open a discussion with athletes, raise your awareness, and maybe, develop some interest, then that's a great point. The actual test results are not that meaningful as far as we're not changing your thresholds. We're not trying to change any zones for you to work to. We weren't using it to try to judge how good you are at this point. It was more about the relative results between the 3 different distances. So hopefully this starts to help you understand your own physiology. And again, that phenotype is just a classification, but have a little bit more of a look into it and see how closely your results were grouped together. If they're quite close, then you certainly can't be classified as any one of those 3 categories. It's just a slight inkling towards that as a strength, or again, away from the others as a weakness. And remember, it's not black or white. It's not good or bad. This is just shades of grey. We are not trying to say you're a sprinter, you're bad. You're a time trialist, you're amazing. It isn't that. You could be very even across the board, or you might be, a very good time trialist and a very good pursuiter, but very weak at sprinting. Equally, you could be, any combination of them. So just have a little bit more of a look into it. And then what we need to decide then with your coaches and in the future is this something we need to act on and start to make a few changes to your training program. The last thing I will say before we leave you to it, I realise I've dragged on for, again, probably nearly 15 minutes. Final thing is with your training and racing, we just need to be mindful. It's about trying to understand what we're trying to get across to you in your sessions, why easy needs to stay easy, and why we need to understand this concept of LT1, which I've not gone into for now, but we need to stay beneath that on easy sessions for the majority of people. And when we're going hard, we're going controllably hard a lot of the time and not using all of this anaerobic energy that we might have. The aerobic system takes a long time to train, and this is why you can improve in triathlon for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years and so on, because the aerobic metabolism, the changes that occur, take a long time. As you can see with my results, the other side of the coin is that you can improve your anaerobic ability, which is largely down to enzyme changes, within a number of weeks, 2 to 6 weeks, and you can see improvements in your anaerobic ability. So it will always tend to dominate the aerobic system if we let it, and we need therefore just be mindful of this. So I'll leave you there for this evening. I hope that's of some help, and feel free to open some discussion with me or with your coaches, and that'll be a very positive outcome from this session on Monday. Hope to see you on the race tomorrow. and have a lovely week.